Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are on to Emerson's collection of journal entries entitled Journal 22, and it is dated from 1831, and the first entry is January 10th of that year. And with that said, I will go ahead and start reading it. I am not to help my neighbor because he is importunate, nor because he wants. That does not express his claim on me, but because he is God's creature as I am. And I have received all, and only hold all I have as occasion of exercising affections. His claim on me is through God, but this claim is nearest of any, for the Bible teaches us that God is in us and in all, and there is therefore something in him which is another and the same as myself. I find myself in my neighbor, and the object of a charity is not to relieve want as an end, but by means of relieving that want, to justify myself to himself, or to fill both of us with God's approbation. He only is a perfect man through whom God's Spirit blows unobstructed, who seeks with all his powers God's ends, seeks usefulness with every muscle, seeks truth in every thought. Herein may be seen all the evil of the great controversy about faith and works. Works done as unto the Lord and not unto men contain faith, and he would be beside himself who should lift a finger against such. Great men are great unto men, and not unto the Lord, and that is the reason why they are so much suspected. The greatest man is he that is not man at all, but merges his human will in the divine, and is merely an image of God. There is a greatness, however, that has been sometimes seen among the gladiators on our political arena, here and in England. I mean that elevation of reason that sees clearly great principles and trusts magnanimously to them in the face of present odium, because it has some insight into their wholesome nature, and is sure they will work good in the end, and so justify themselves to the times and to posterity. This we call noble, and do not grudge our applause. It takes advantage of that moral advancement which the world has made, and is a tribute to that. This has been done by the Pitts and Burkes and Websters, and is second only to the praise of godliness. They do not act unto men as they are, but to men as they ought to be, and as some are. If there were no good men, they would not thus act, and they will not now act thus steadily invariably. If they acted to the Lord, they would thus act always, and they would find this course of action full of sweetness, and not full of chagrin, as Burkes confesses it is. January 24th, 1831. I believe it is true that the devout theist and the devout Christian will agree fully as to their duty. The preceptive part of Christianity enjoins no rules of actions which are not binding on the theist. It enjoins love of relations, friends, country, mankind, and the strictest virtues according to the ancient idea of virtue, but with this first and last injunction, that they should be done as unto God. If this is so, then to be an enemy of Christianity is to be an enemy to one's own self. Let nobody suppose that what are by some seats called the peculiar, essential doctrines of Christianity, regeneration, justification by faith, makes an exception to this remark, or not enjoined by the conscience. These doctrines, like everything in dispute, have been strained a great way, yea, out of all shape, but they are originally solemn verities, and in that shape, if presented by an ancient philosopher, would have to a sound mind absolute authority. Ellen Tucker Emerson died 8th February, Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock. Chardon Street, February 13th, 1831. 5 days are wasted since Ellen went to heaven to see, to know, to worship, to love, to intercede. Reunite us, O thou Father of our spirits. There is that which passes away and never returns. This miserable apathy, I know, may wear off. I almost fear when it will. Old duties will present themselves with no more repulsive face. I shall go again among my friends with a tranquil countenance. Again I shall be amused, I shall stoop again to little hopes and little fears, and forget the graveyard. But will the dead be restored to me? Will the eye that was closed on Tuesday ever beam again in the fullness of love on me? Shall I ever again be able to connect the face of outward nature, the mists of morn, the star of eve, the flowers, and all poetry, with the heart and life of an enchanting friend? No. There is one birth, and one baptism, and one first love, and the affections cannot keep their youth any more than men. Her end was blessed, and a fit termination to such a career. She prayed that God would speedily release her from her body, and that she might not make this prayer to be rid of her pains. But because thy favor is better than life, Take me, O God, to thyself, was frequently on her lips. Never anyone spake with greater simplicity or cheerfulness of dying. She said, I pray for sincerity, and that I may not talk, but may realize what I say. She did not think she had a wish to get well. Then here follows a series of Latin words, and I don't know what the translation might be. February 23rd, 1831. The questions that come to me this evening are few and simple. It is worth recording that Plotinus said, Of the unity of God nothing can be predicated, neither being, nor essence, nor life, for it is above all these. Granted is to recognize the truth of this and of every one of that first class of truths which are necessary. Thus, design proves a designer, like must know like, or the same can only be known by the same, out of which come the propositions in ethics. Si vis amari ama, and God without can only be known by God within, and the scriptures can be explained only by that Spirit which dictated them, and 1,000 sayings more which have a quasi-truth instantly to the ear, the real truth of which is this elementary fact in all. Like must know like. It would be well for every mind to collect with care every truth of this kind he may meet, and make a catalogue of necessary truths. They are scanned and approved by the reason far above the understanding. They are the last facts by which we approximate metaphysically to God. March 13th. Paul says that his preaching was made effectual to the Gentiles by the same Spirit as Peter's preaching to the circumcision. He saith rightly, There is one light through 1,000 stars, there is one Spirit through myriad mouths. It will not do to divide or bound what is in itself infinite. Every word of truth that is spoken by man's lips is from God. Every thought that is true is from God. Every right act is from God. All these are as much done by his Spirit as the miracle of the Pentecost. They are of the same sort as that influence. The apostle who prophesied or who wrought a miracle felt that his word or his act was as true to the occasion as he did when he lifted bread to his mouth that he might eat. The prophet understood his prediction. The apostle willed the cure of the cripple. If you ask how he wrought the miracle, I ask how you lift your arm. By God. I suppose that miraculous power is only more power. I suppose it is strictly of the same kind, for I suppose there is but one kind. There is but one source of power, that is God. The reason why I insist on this uniformity and universality of spiritual influence is because any other view that can be taken of the Holy Ghost is idolatrous. If it be received into the mind as a person and be separated from God and God's common operation, that moment the idea of God receives a wound in you. All that is added to the new power is taken from him. A man tells me that the Spirit has been poured out in a great reformation. Does he mean anything more or anything different from saying that God, in the infinite variety of his accustomed ways, has made some men better? If he does mean differently, he means wrong. Does he speak so fervently of the Spirit as to imply more? I say he is doing injury to his own mind in breaking up the thought of God into fragments. Literally, he is changing the glory of the incorruptible God into idols, made like unto good yet corruptible men. But, it will be said, the Comforter, the Advocate whom the Saviour speaks of, did he mean nothing? Truly he meant what he said. The Comforter whom the Father will send you, that is the Spirit of truth. I know well, many will not fail to say, to what purpose is this attempt to explain away so safe and holy a doctrine as that of the Holy Spirit? Why unsettle or disturb a faith which presents to many minds a helpful medium by which they approach the idea of God? And this question I will meet. It is because I think the popular views of this principle are pernicious, because it does put a medium, because it removes the idea of God from the mind. It leaves some events, some things, some thoughts out of the power of him who causes every event, every flower, every thought. The tremendous idea, as I may well call it, of God is screened from the soul. Men are made to feel as if they ate their dinner and committed their common sins somewhere in the purlieus of the creation behind a screen, for the Spirit of God works in a church or in Judea and not in the vulgar affairs of every day. The Spirit of God teaches us, on the contrary, that not a star rolls in space, that not a pulse beats in a single heart, not a bird drops from the bough, not an atom moves throughout the wide universe, but is bound in the chains of his omnipotent thought, not a lawless particle. And least of all we can believe, reason will not let us, that the presiding Creator commands all matter and never descends into the secret chambers of the soul. There he is most present. The soul rules over matter. Matter may pass away like a mote in the sunbeam, may be absorbed into the immensity of God as a mist is absorbed into the heat of the sun, but the soul is the kingdom of God, the abode of love, of truth, of virtue. The bringing all minds into union with him is the work which God worketh from age to age. Concord, March 4th. Our goodness is so low that it scarce seems to approximate to truth, and our knowledge so scanty that it does not approximate to virtue. But in God they are one. He is perfectly wise because he is perfectly good, and perfectly good because he is perfectly wise. We say of a bad man that he will not believe because he cannot understand the great action of a moral hero. Did we ever see an exhibition of intellectual power by a good man that was not aided, enforced, and that in the intellectual truth too, by his goodness? Milton, Burke, and Webster get most of their wisdom from the heart. The religion that is afraid of science dishonors God and commits suicide. It acknowledges that it is not equal to the whole of truth, that it legislates, tyrannizes over a village of God's empire, but is not the immutable universal law. Every influx of atheism, of skepticism, is thus made useful as a mercury pill, assaulting and removing a diseased religion and making way for truth, and itself is presently purged into the drought. Keep the soul always turned to God, nothing so vast but feel that he contains it. If your idea of him is dim or perplexed, pray and think and act more. It is the education of the soul. It is the sure way of individual increase. Sincerity is always holy and always strong. Come good or ill, the pure in heart are in the right way. And presently and often you shall be rewarded with clearer perception, the sense of more intimate communion. Dear friendship or solitary piety is often conscious that God's approbation rests upon it. Voltaire forsook good aiming at truth, and grew up half or less than half a man, a colorless plant grown in the dark, and many a religionist hurts the cause of religion by the opposite error. It is all reception. More genius does not increase the individuality, but the community of each mind. In the wisdom or fancy, which is oft wisdom, or of Bacon and Shakespeare, we do not admire an arbitrary alien creation, but we have surprising at finding ourselves, at recognizing our own truth in that wild, unacquainted field. Who knows that he has got all the truth he might have? Who dares to think he has got all the good he might have? We dip our fingertips in the sea that would make us invulnerable if we would plunge and swim. Out upon the cold, hard-eyed zealot, whose whole religion and whole sect and all his missions and all his prodigality of means go to stifle the flame of holy love which young and heroic minds are nourishing, go to traduce the spirit of man. All wisdom, all genius is reception. The more perfect the character and the more rich the gifts, the more would the individual seem sunk, and the more unmixed would the truth he possessed appear. He would exist merely to impart and to hang on the first cause, a Socrates, a Jesus. The moment you describe Milton's verse, you use words implying, not creation, but increased perception, second sight knowledge of what is, beyond the ken of others. Yet these are prophecy. Various psychological facts to be remembered. Socrates' abstraction, Anaxagoras, Hermotimus burned in a trance, Plotinus, Marivaux's description of inequality of mental states, Newton saying that attention to what is true is all, Shakespeare and Bacon as attentive to what is true as Kirby or Swammerdam. Whole zeal of opposers of one uniform, spiritual influence proceeds not from inattention to the strictly divine character of ordinary phenomena. All is miracle, and the mind revolts at representations of two kinds of miracles. Here follows several Latin words in a sentence which is not translated. Will God work only in geology and not come into secret chambers of spirit? Seek to dwell with God, O man. Let all the common duties derive dignity from the dedication to the Most High. Live forever shall be writ on every thought. A day will not suffice, but form habits of grand life. Form yourself, your affections, your friendships, your charities, your talk, your commercial dealings, on principles so vast it will infuse a mighty soul into them all. God will be felt. Cannot a mind thus formed or reformed better understand a science or an honest art than another? Can it not acquire such self-subsistence as to give, not take, character from its neighborhood? The imputation to which priests have always been subjected is that their private and their public discourses differ, that whilst they say one thing formally, they sympathize fully with other men in private, and reason and apprehend or regret the same trivial inconveniences as they. Now this is the fault of the priest in part the fault of man, and in part the mistake of the censurer. Who expects that the worshipper of God should be wholly grave overlooks a great part of nature. A grave man is no more a perfect character than a jester. There are many truths manifested by the ridiculous, and in intelligent society abundance of humor and wit will appear. No one can take sufficiently generous views of providence. None can go out into the fields and see rejoicing beauties of morning and of spring, or enter an evening party, without feeling that God never meant that his children should shun each other or should wear a sad countenance. What follows is a poem written at Chardon Street, Boston, spring of 1831. Dear brother, would you know the life, please God, that I would lead? On the first wheels that quit this weary town, over yon western bridges I would ride, and with a cheerful benison forsake each street and spire and roof and continent. Then would I seek where God would guide my steps, amid the mountain shires, Hants, Franklin, Berks, where down the rock ravine a river roars, even from a brook, and where old woods, not tamed and cleared, cumber the ground with their centennial wrecks. Find me a slope where I can feel the sun and mark the rising of the early stars. There will I bring my books, my household gods, the reliquaries of my dead saint, and dwell in the sweet odor of her memory. Then in the uncouth solitude unlock my stock of art, plant dials in the grass, hang in the air a bright thermometer, and aim a telescope at the inviolate sun. April 1st, 1831. The spring is wearing into summer, and life is wearing into death. Our friends are forsaking us, our hopes are declining, our riches are wasting, our mortifications are increasing, and is the question settled in our minds what objects we pursue with undivided aim? Have we fixed ourselves by principles? Have we planted our stakes? April 3rd. Trust to that prompting within you. No man ever got above it. Men have transgressed and hated and blasphemed it, but no man ever sinned but he felt it towering above him and threatening him with ruin. The troubled water reflects no image. When it is calm, it shows within it the whole face of heaven. Our vices even prove the being of God as shadows point in the direction of the sun. It is a luxury to be understood. Boston, April 4th. The days go by, griefs and simpers and sloth and disappointments. The dead do not return, and sometimes we are negligent of their image. Not of yours, Ellen. I know too well who is gone from me. And here come on formal duties which are to be formally discharged, and in our sluggish minds no sentiment rises to quicken them, they seem. And when the fast comes, what shall I say? It is forgot and despised. It is the remainder of an ancient race, and like old furniture to be dispensed with, it is huddled aside by the upstart generation, as if it were a disgrace to the refinement and enlarged view of things. Perhaps there yet remains in the present race so much kindness, so many kindred to the former, as will not like to see their venerable usages trampled upon. Something may be said for those old people, that generous race who delivered two countries, England and America, from tyranny, and founded the institutions by which our fathers and ourselves were reared. It is well to remember the departed. Even savages keep their fathers' bones. The noble love the dead. The Jews were taught in their prosperity to remember the day of small things, to remember the outcast Joseph and say, "My father was a Syrian and went down a bondman to Egypt." They were taught to remember in their prosperity the stranger and say, "I was a stranger when the Lord brought me into this land." And happy would be the people of this land if they never grow unmindful of their stock and stem, for we remember that which is like ourselves. If the pride of ancestry from men that loved God and freedom more than worldly good does not fade out of their minds, we may grow so besotted as to think that a disgrace, which is our chiefest ornament, like the stag in the fable. A fop thinks the simple dress and manners of his country father mean. Let us not be such coxcombs as to dishonor the gray hairs of the Puritans. I think of them as men whom God honored with great usefulness. That solid sense, that explanation of the inner man, that greater reverence for history, for law, which they had, may compensate for thrift and mechanical improvements and fine houses which they had not. Seriousness may be forgiven to the redeemers of suffering, liberty to the defenders of religion, to the pious men who kept their integrity in an unholy age. Danger is when men will not keep quiet and grow restless from turning the eye out instead of inward. When those men had asserted their rights, they were appeased and still. We think stillness stagnation, and in a man want of thought. It is want of thought that makes this everlasting inquietude. Great men, great thoughts have they bequeathed to the world. I will honor their institution, if only because it was theirs. Whatever relic precious has come down, I won't spit upon. I will respect this fast as a connecting link by which the posterity are bound to the fathers, as a trump through which the voice of the fathers speaks. April 9th. Pleasure taken in Ravenswood's grand feudal character great. And why? Because the contemplation of somebody that we could depend on, and should without risk admire and love if we should converse with him, is pleasing. The soul believes in its own immortality, and whilst this character floats before it, is already anticipating intercourse with such and other states of being. Is it not too that by the law of sympathy the soul sees in every great character only a mirror in which its own pinched features are expanded to true dimensions? Quote, the shows of things to the desires of the mind, end quote. And does it not find a lesson herein? The suggestion that a mind raised above circumstances may fight this heroic battle day by day, that Sir William Ashton is only another name for a vulgar temptation, that Ravenswood Castle is only another name for proud poverty and the quote-unquote foreign mission of state, only a Bunyan disguise for honest industry, that we may all shoot a wild bull that would toss the good and beautiful by fighting down the unjust and sensual, that Lucy is another word for fidelity, which is always beautiful and always liable to great suffering in the world, but which is true to itself and trusts God for success in the abysses of his designs. April 11th, 1831. The love of novels is the preference of sentiment to the senses. Who are they that love an ideal world and dwell in it? The young, the pure, who believe that love is stronger than lust, who delight in the belief that virtue may prevail over the power of circumstances. If the principles of Jesus could take possession of all breasts, life would not be vile. Society would be pure, but not puritanical. 'Tis because we are such half-faced friends of God that we have this awkwardness of religion, holiness without beauty. In its source, it is the all-fair. A community of Christians would be a field of splendid occasions, exciting recollections, purposes, grand characters and epical situations that would leave the loftiest fiction of prose or verse far beneath it. What you seek in these novels is the friendships you would form with tempers so true and majestic, on which an infinite trust might be reposed. They would act for you across the earth and could not be bribed or scared or cooled. Now in every mind is the material of all this romance, and that is the way in which every mind is heir of heaven. Have you not ever felt the pleasure, the tossing, the turmoil of a lofty sentiment, when your pillow would not give rest to your head because of the delight of what you had done or determined? How was life ennobled, and death in that hour lost much of his dread? Is there not a living in the world, the person for whose advantages you would eagerly have made costliest sacrifices? The sentiment, that occasion, was the beginning of all good to you, if only you persevered in, and if you have left that way, you have wandered, and how have you fared? Therefore is life stale and cheap. It is wonderful that men do not learn this lesson from love, so familiar in its lower stages, but seldom carried to any heights. Quote, all other pleasures are not worth its pains. End quote. Now a greater heroism than has delighted you in Wallace or Richard or Ravenswood is offered to you. In the common sun and air, in the paved street, in all the details trite of vulgar life you may tread with the step of a king. You may not fight down rivals, but you may live like a wise man among silly people. Among gluttons and sycophants you may carry the hand of Franklin and the heart of Paul, and the good call out great sentiments as well as give them out. That which is like you in other minds will start from sleep in your presence. April 23rd. What so fit for man is trust? He did not make himself. He has no finger in the operations of the universe. Let him be calm. Let him assume the port of a resolved mind that waits an enemy, but does not fear him. This is the first step. Then let him open his eye and heart to the good he has received and put his finger, if he can, on his title deed. Are you so happy? Have you so much? The height of your fear shows the price of your stake. Well now, by what right is it yours? It is all received, and if any cause to complain, it is that it would be inconsistent with the goodness that has been shown you not to show you more, not with your merits, observe, but with that grace. Well then, I don't see but you may trust it still. Again, man is greater by leaning on the greatest. Nature is commanded by obeying her. God lends his strength to the good. Thus it is the wisest, first, because you cannot help yourself, any whimpering would be ridiculous, and secondly, 'tis wisest, because there's every reason for affectionate trust, for a voluntary act of approval of God's order. What so sublime and so indicative of a perception of the matchless wisdom that directs as implicit trust? Quote, one man may lead a horse to water, but 10 cannot make him drink. End quote. It is so in the order of providence with man. Heaven guards his freedom so carefully that nothing compels him to enter into the spirit of the festival to which he is invited. He may pout in the corner, if he will, and suck his thumbs. But the loss is his own. The company is large and can easily spare him, but he would do more wisely to conform himself to circumstances intended kindly and carry forward the brilliant game. April 25th. From our feeble hands we drop the tools. Nobody thinks of the duty and the nobleness of instituting a perfect life. Nobody acts 3 days on a system. A man rises from a good book or from a good example, and the eternal chord in him vibrates to heaven's melody a moment, and then the superincumbent flesh stops his tone. If in the some distant world the visions of these weeks we are now so idly spending shall come full on the memory, is it not probable they will be attended with poignant regret? Shan't we think what capabilities and what nothings of act? Perhaps we cannot even form steady views of duty. Then we are very low indeed, and this defect should alarm us. But there is a capacity of virtue in us, and there is a capacity of vice to make your blood creep. Then there is a sentence in Latin about Plotinus, or referring to Plotinus, which there is no translation for. What follows now is a translation. It says Schiller's Wallenstein, Coleridge's translation, and I'll read it. It's like a poem. In their distress they call a spirit up, and when he comes straight their flesh creeps and quivers, and they dread him more than the ills for which they called him up. The uncommon, the sublime, must seem and be like things of every day. But in the field, there the present being makes itself felt. The personal must command, the actual eye examine. If to be the chieftain asks all that is great in nature, let it be likewise his privilege to move and act in all the correspondencies of greatness. The oracle within him, that which lives, he must invoke and question, not dead books, not ordinances, not mold-rotted papers. Schiller's Wallenstein, Coleridge's translation. And then here follows, I believe, other quotations from the same source. Quote, in your own bosom are you destiny's stars, confidence in yourself, prompt resolution. This is your Venus, and the soul malignant, the only one that harmeth you, is doubt. End quote. Quote, at the approach of extreme peril, when a hollow image is found, a hollow image and no more, then falls the power into the mighty hands of nature and the spirit giant born who listens only to himself. End quote. Quote, of its own beauty is the mind diseased and fevers into false creation. End quote. Admiration is a sure mark of a noble mind. Uncommon boys follow uncommon men. Vulgar minds are too much wrapped up in themselves to mark, much less to estimate, another's merits, though they shine as the sun. But you admire and you despair. You have no fellowship with what you admire, and it seems to you that life is a waste where all your fellows act on their low motives and pour out all the vessels of ridicule on the innocents who would hope to act on any better, as unpractical and romantic. Love, even, and high sentiments are regarded as boarding school wares. Well, now, what is the lesson God teaches you hereby as with an angel's trumpet? That you should sternly conform your life to the dictates of lofty sentiment? That you should be what you admire? But you say, nobody can. Nobody will estimate me. Very likely, but that is exactly the scope and occasion of great sentiments, to prompt right and against the voice, it may be, of the whole world. Every popinjay blows with the wind. The thunder cloud sails against it. Men take counsel in moments of peril, the deceptive face of things, and not from themselves. Always listen to yourself. Never be tempted to a word of vanity or of pride. Persist in the old vulgar road of benevolence. Make his good with whom you deal a real omnipresent motive, whilst and whenever you deal with him. Persist, only persist in seeking the truth. Persist in saying you do not know what you do not know, and you do not care for what you do not care. May 18th, 1831. Went tonight to the Sunday school meeting, but was myself a dumb dog that could not bark. Question was whether the instruction at Sunday school should be exclusively religious. I should have said that in God's goodness this instruction blessed twice him that gives him and that takes. Teacher must consider it an institution whence he is to derive most essential benefit, and in order to give and gain the most, he is to aim at the great end with his whole might. If he fill himself with an earnest love of God, all the rest shall be added unto him. The question will answer itself in his practice. It is well known that it is the property of the human mind, when strongly aroused by any sentiment, by any passion, by the love of any science or art, to give its whole knowledge and powers the new force of an arrangement after that principle. And then it acts with as much more efficiency than before, as an organized army acts than a great mob. Whatever passion, whatever love arrives at a certain heat in a mind, melts away all resistance, fuses all its knowledge, turns everything like fire to its own nature. The poet casts his eyes on no object, how mean soever, not on a tub or shoe, but it grows poetical in his eye. The whole world is a poem to him. The mathematician does not see the dome of a church or the corner of a house or of a table, but it is a diagram to prove a truth in geometry. The mourner reads his loss in every utensil in his house, in every garment, in the face of every friend. Well now, let the Sunday school teacher dwell fervently alone on the great idea whose servants and worshippers we all are. Let him be in heart and soul a worshipper of God, and he will find no need to prescribe rules to direct his instructions into one or another course. He will see the religious face of everything. He will draw precisely that tone and accord of thought he wants from things you would call common and unclean. He will do better than a fable told of the Lydian king whose touch turned everything to gold. He will show everything to be good and from God. But I see the meanness of this illustration. Let me offer a better. He will be like the hand of Christ, which touched the rolling eyeball, and it saw which touched the paralytic, and he was made whole. Yea, and was laid upon dead bones, and they started up again into human life, and praised God. He will be a freeman whom the truth has made free, and will put the whole compass of all his reading and all his experience under the contribution to convey proofs of God's being and providence into the mind of his pupil. Nobody doubts, I suppose, that this can be done. Every chip and seaweed contributes its part to the gravity of the system, and every object in the universe, every truth bears testimony to God. May 20th. Blind men in Rome complained that the streets were dark. To dull the mind all nature is leaden. To the illuminated mind the whole world burns and sparkles with light. You read a poor essayist, and you feel humiliated at the poverty of human wit. A few oft-repeated saws seem to be all it has attained. You read Burton or Montaigne or Sir Thomas Browne. You read Bacon, and you are in wonder at the profusion of wise observations which they seem to have barreled up from the vast commonplaces of mankind. The more a man knows, he is the more prepared scholar. The magazine shows more inexhaustible, and the particulars of greater price every moment. Every weed, every atom discloses its relations. Mens agitat molem. Quote, to virtue every day is bright, and every hour propitious to diligence. And that is the virtue of increased intelligence, that it imparts worth to what was counted worthless. The progress of manufacturers finds a yellow dye in a crumbling rubbish stone, plants a thistle for its teasel. plucks a whortleberry bush for unwinding silk, saves the coke after the coal is burned, and saves the ashes after the coke is consumed, and so works up into its process the refuge and dung of the world with the frugality of nature herself. Mens agitat molem, the whole is instinct with life. Written at Williamstown, Vermont, June 1st, 1831, a series of poetry extracts, it looks like. Why fear to die, and let thy body lie under the flowers of June, thy body food for the ground worm's brood, and thy grave smiled on by visiting moon? Amid great nature's halls, girt in by mountain walls, and washed with waterfalls, it would please me to die, where every wind that swept my tomb goes loaded with a free perfume, dealt out with a God's charity. I should like to lie in sweets, a hill's leaves for winding sheets, and the searching sun to see that I am laid with decency, and the commissioned wind to sing his mighty psalms from fall to spring, and annual tunes commemorate of nature's child the common fate. Here's a poem entitled Ellen. Dust unto dust, and shall no more be said, Ellen, for thee, and shall a common fate blend thy last hour with the last hours of all? Of thee, my wife, my undefiled, my dear, the muse thy living beauty could inspire shall spare one verse to strow thy urn or be forever silent. Ellen is dead, she who outshone all beauty, yet knew not that she was beautiful, she who was fair after another mold than flesh and blood. Her beauty was of God, the Maker's hand yet rested on its work, and cast an atmosphere of sanctity around her steps that pleased old age and youth. Yea, that not won the eye, but did persuade the soul by realizing human hopes, teaching that faith and love were not a dream, teaching that purity had yet a shrine, and that the innocent and affectionate thoughts that harbor in the bosom of a child might live embodied in a riper form, and dwell with wisdom never bought by sin. Blessed, sweet singer were the ears that heard, to her the eye that saw bear witness. June 15th. After a fortnight's wandering to the Green Mountains and Lake Champlain, yet finding you, dear Ellen, nowhere and yet everywhere, I come again to my own place and would willingly transfer some of the pictures that the eye saw in living language to my page, yea, translate the fair and magnificent symbols into their own sentiments. But this were to antedate knowledge. It grows into us, say rather, we grow wise and not take wisdom, and only in God's own order, and by my concurrent effort can I get the abstract sense of which mountains, sunshine, thunders, night, birds, and flowers are the sublime alphabet. June 20th. I suppose it is not wise, not being natural, to belong to any religious party. In the Bible, you are not directed to be a Unitarian or a Calvinist or an Episcopalian. Now, if a man is wise, he will not only not profess himself to be a Unitarian, but he will say to himself, I am not a member of that or of any party. I am God's child, a disciple of Christ, or in the eye of God, a fellow disciple with Christ. Now let a man get into a stagecoach with his distinct understanding of himself, divorcing himself in his heart from every party, and let him meet with religious men of every different sect, and he will find scarce any proposition uttered by them to which he does not assent, and none to the sentiment of which he does not assent, though he may insist on varying the language. As fast as any man becomes great, that is, thinks, he becomes a new party. Socrates, Aristotle, Calvin, Luther, Abelard, what are these but names of parties? Which is to say, as fast as we use our own eyes, we quit these parties, or unthinking corporations, and join ourselves to God in an unpartaken relation. A sect or party is an elegant incognito devised to save a man from the vexation of thinking. Since to govern my passions with absolute sway is the work I have to do, I cannot but think that the sect for the suppression of intemperance, or a sect for the suppression of loose behavior to women would be a more reasonable and useful society than the Orthodox sect, which is a society for the suppression of Unitarianism, or the Unitarian, which is a society for the diffusion of useful knowledge. Religion is the relation of the soul to God, and therefore the progress of sectarianism marks the decline of religion. For looking at God instantly reduces our disposition to dissent from our brother. A man may die by a fever as well as by consumption, and religion is as effectually destroyed by bigotry as by indifference. The best part of wisdom can never be communicated as, quote, books never can teach the use of books, end quote. And as Bacon said, quote, the best part of beauty could not be represented in a picture, end quote. To a philosophical infidel, the writings of Thomas à Kempis, of Fenelon, of Skugel should be shown, for the fact that such a new science as this they treat has been drawn out of the New Testament, the creation of such a theory as the mind of Thomas à Kempis, evolved in its very nature, claiming authority over all other principles, is a mighty evidence for the divine authority of Scripture. Wherever goes a man, there goes a great soul. I never more fully possess myself than in slovenly or disagreeable circumstances. When I stamp through the mud in dirty boots, I hug myself with the feeling of my immortality. I then reflect complacently on whatever delicacy is in my taste, of amplitude in my memory. In a university I draw in my horns. On nothing does a wise man plume himself so much as on independence of circumstances, that in a kitchen or dirty street or sweltering stagecoach he can separate himself from impure contact and embosom himself in the sublime society of his recollections, of his hopes, and of his affections. Ambassador carries his country with him, so does the mind. The days pass over me, and I am still the same. The aroma of my life is gone, like the flower with which it came. From blotting book number 3, June 1831, there is a untranslated Latin quotation from Giordano Bruno. And now a couple one by Stewart and one by Wordsworth. The one by Stewart reads, "Our first and third thoughts coincide." The one by Wordsworth, it says, "We know the arduous strife, the eternal laws, to which the triumph of all good is given, high sacrifice and labor without pause, even to the death, else wherefore should the eye of man converse with immortality?" At this point, I will conclude this reading of Emerson's journals. We have not completed journal collection number 22, I believe. But journal collection number 22 is a very large collection, and so not to make this particular video almost 2 hours long or something like that, I will stop it here and pick up with the very next one in the next video. We will pick up with Emerson journal entry at Chardon Street, Boston, June 29th, 1831. And according to this volume 2, it's page 389 in case anybody is wanting to make sure they're in the right place if they're reading along or listening. With that said, thank you for listening.